Hello, everybody, and welcome again. This is our fourth and last week of the Worldview series, and thank you for those who've joined us over the weeks and those who are here for the first time. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about kind of how we apply, but what we've talked about. So we've talked about what is a worldview, what's a biblical worldview, what is a secular worldview, because that's a very common thing that we find today. And today I want to talk a little bit about how do we engage people when they start talking about worldview issues. But it's not just worldview issues. These principles relate to most conversations, and especially difficult conversations, especially about faith, but also many other things. So it's kind of tactics or principles that you can apply in many different situations, and I hope you'll find them useful. So if you want to engage someone who has a different worldview, let's say you're at the hair salon, ladies, and the hairdresser says something that's like completely opposed to a biblical worldview. And then people normally have one of three reactions. So they either fight, or they flee, or they yield. So what does that look like? So you're at a dinner party and the hostess says something like, "Oh, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you are sincere." Now, we talked about this in week 1, and we said that people can be very sincere and very sincerely wrong at that. For instance, we used Hitler as an example of somebody who was very sincere about what he believed. He felt very strong about it. He literally threw everything in it and caused millions of deaths in the process. So obviously sincerity is not always a good thing. It actually matters what you believe. So what do you do when somebody says that at the dinner table or at a party or at a restaurant? So you can go all ninja and say, well, I'm sure Hitler was very sincere about his beliefs, but that didn't turn out so well, now did it? That would be a little bit aggressive, even though it's correct. You might win the argument, but you are bound to lose the person. And that's the thing. There are wonderful ways to win arguments and lose people in the process, and that is not our goal. Or you can say, I think I need another drink, and get up from the table. This is a firm favorite for those of us who have conflict avoidance issues. We just avoid it, or we change the subject. Or you yield. You just want to be nice, and you just want to get along, and you just want peace and agreeableness around the dinner table. So you just say, oh, absolutely, my neighbor is a Muslim and she's such a wonderful person. Even if you believe that Islam as a religion is wrong, you don't want to say it right now because you just want to be pleasant. So you say something pleasant, and it's not wrong. It's true that your neighbor is a wonderful person, and you're not lying. You're just agreeing to be nice. Okay. So, but is there a better way in which we can build a bridge from the other person's worldview to a biblical worldview? And not necessarily your view. Remember, you have to make sure that you align your view, your worldview, with a biblical worldview, and that if you want to not attack, but if you want to address something or comment on something, make sure it's something that's actually a biblical issue and not a political issue or a personal issue or a very fringe issue of something that the church has been arguing about for 2,000 years. Especially if it's somebody who's not saved, they say something that's on the fringe of Bible truths or something that you just personally disagree with. Be careful, affirm what you can affirm. But if you feel, now I really have to say something, then let's talk about how do you do that. So the book that I'm using, I have a copy of the book here. So if anybody wants to look at it afterwards, you're welcome to. How many of you remember Inspector Columbo, Detective Columbo? So this is nice about talking to a more mature audience. They know what I'm talking about. So do you remember he used to, it's okay, he used to come into, he will talk to somebody and he'll pretend to be like really, like not very clever, like, and then he'll walk and then he'll come back and he'll scratch his head. There's something about this that I don't understand. There's something that's bothering me. Usually there's something here that's bothering me. And then he asked something. So Greg Koukl, who wrote this book, he talks about Columbo tactics, and it's asking specific questions. So we'll look at those in a moment. But before we do, I want to say there are a few things that we have to keep in mind. When we engage somebody, when they said something that's just horribly wrong and you feel like you cannot let this go, it will damage the gospel. This is what they believe, and now they said it at the table and now everyone's going, oh, and you just feel like, no, I can't let this go. To do what Colossians 4 says, to be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders, especially. And to make the most of every opportunity. And otherwise, don't just keep quiet and keep the peace. So make the most of the opportunity, but let your conversation be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. So this is talking about being smart and being nice. And then 1 Peter 3:15 says to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. That's the classic apologetics verse. Why do we do apologetics? Because we have to be ready to give a reasoned answer, a logical answer, but to do this with gentleness and respect. And there's love and there's truth. And people often feel that these two things are opposites. And you can either be loving or you can be truthful. And you can attack people with the truth, or you can just love them and accept everything. But it's a false dichotomy. That's the proper logical fallacy name of that, which we'll hopefully learn about later in the year. It's a false dichotomy. These things are not opposed. You cannot love someone properly if you do not tell them the truth. If we can use our brother Mike as an example again, when he went to the doctor and the doctor wanted to be nice to him and just pat him on the back and didn't want to tell him that he had pancreatic cancer, he could have walked out of there feeling, oh, the doctor gave me good news, but it would have been a lie. And that would have been unloving. Because the loving thing to do was to tell him this horrible news and to tell him we're going to do something about it. And the treatment's going to be horrible, but we're going to try to save your life. And they did. So the truth is part of loving someone. Letting someone live in a lie is not loving. If I let my little kid, when they were still crawling, see those 3 little holes in the wall, and they're like, oh, that is awesome. It's just the right size for my fingers. Like, oh, my little one, you're so clever and whatever. If that makes you happy, just, happiness is the ultimate goal in life. Just do what makes you happy. I wouldn't do that. That would be unloving. I would stop them. I will tell them the truth and say, no, you can't touch that. It's dangerous. So don't think of love and truth as being opposed. But we don't have to be the one lady who tells parents how to raise their children with a biblical worldview. She says, don't turn your children into terrifying truth tellers. Terrifying little truth is like pointing at everybody and judging everybody and being nasty about it. Tell them to also still be respectful. And then the last thing is to be tactical, and that's a little bit about what we're talking about tonight. And then 2 other things to keep in mind is Greg Koukl suggests something which he calls a gardening approach to evangelization. So when you want, let's say, a harvest of fruit in your garden, you don't just walk out of the door one day and say, okay, I'm going to pick some fruit and pick some fruit. It doesn't work like that. It's a very long process. It starts with preparing the soil and sowing seeds and watering it and nurturing and spraying pests and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and a lot of patience input. And for a lot of people, this is how they end up coming to Christ. Somebody prepares the soil, somebody sows the seed. Maybe many years later, some growth starts happening. And hopefully somebody doesn't step on the little sapling. Maybe it will take years for them to grow until there's fruit. And then somebody can come and pick that fruit. And we don't always have to be the person who picks that low-hanging fruit. Sometimes we are just the person preparing the soil. Some people are so far away, they believe so many lies, that maybe you just have to make them question that one lie they've believed for so many years. Just question that. And over time, they will start realizing, maybe I was wrong about this. And then somebody else can come with the truth. And then the soil is prepared. So I like that approach. It takes a bit of pressure off you to feel like I have to always close the deal. And it helps you to see a bigger picture. Sometimes you just have to leave a pebble in their shoe. I do like that thing also, to talk to someone and just make them wonder a little bit. And sometimes you can go further than that. I read this book once about evangelization, and this guy said how we need to talk to people on the street doing evangelization. He would say something, and then he would back off. He would take a step back to allow that person to like physically give them the space to walk away and to say, okay, thank you, bye-bye, have a nice day, and to walk off. So, and he once had a conversation with someone where he said something or asked something, and that person said something, and every time he finished, he stepped back and let that person respond, and then said something again and stepped back. He said by the end of the conversation, they'd moved all the way down the street because that person kept wanting to engage, but he kept giving him the opportunity to say, I've had enough. I can't deal with this right now. It never felt like it was being forced on him. He wanted to engage. He was ready. And I like that idea. Okay. So what I'm proposing tonight is that we use questions when we have a conversation. I'm going to tell you what the questions are that we can use. But before I do, I want to tell you why should we use questions. And the first thing to remember is to be sincerely curious when you ask somebody questions about their view or their worldview. Don't make it feel like an interrogation. Really ask them about what they believe and really listen and really try to understand before you respond. I think the person that does this the best, according to me, is Sean McDowell. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Josh McDowell, who wrote More Than a Carpenter. His son, Sean, he is very, very good at this. I watched an interview once that he did with a lady who calls herself the original lesbian YouTuber. And they were talking about transgender issues, because even though she's a lesbian and she used to be very, very on the left, she's now very against this whole trans movement. She finds it very offensive to her lesbian, what shall we call it, ideas. But he had more than an hour of a conversation with her, and he just asked and asked and asked. And he just gave her time to talk and asked more and asked more and asked more. And when she would say something that she was brought up in a Catholic home, and both her and her brother decided that they were gay when they were adults. And she said, and at one point she said, because Christians say this and this and this and this. And it was completely a misrepresentation of a biblical worldview. And then Sean just asked very respectfully, would you mind if I responded to that? Could I give you my view on that, like a biblical view? Oh, yes, of course, she said, because he was so nicely. And then he had the opportunity to share the gospel, to say, no, that is not what Christians say. That is not, well, maybe some Christians say that, but that is not what the Bible says. The Bible says this and this. And he very lovingly and very respectful. And then he asked her about her things again, and he let her talk and talk and talk. He's a very good example. And after that whole conversation, everybody who watches that has a very good idea of what she believes and what are the issues and how you can talk about it, because he really let her talk. But the reasons why we use questions, it clarifies the other person's point for you. So sometimes somebody says something and we are so, we feel we just want to respond. but we misunderstood what they mean. And then we start defending something that they didn't attack, or we start responding to something that they did not say or they didn't mean to say. So the first thing you want to do when you ask questions is to just make sure that you understood them correctly and that you're talking about the same thing. The other thing is it helps to clarify their point for themselves, because sometimes people have a very mumbled idea about something. It's very jumbled in their heads. They've got this really strange jumbled, and when they say it out loud and you ask them, so do you mean this? Then all of a sudden they realize, when you say it like that, it sounds really silly, and sometimes that's enough to already leave them with that pebble in their shoe. When you ask a question, it also gives you time to think, because then they have to respond, and then you can think about what they're saying, and you can start processing it, and you can start thinking about a response. And then another thing that it does is it shifts the burden of proof, or some questions that you use can do this. So often we feel, if somebody will say something, look, the Bible is just a bunch of old stories from people who wrote it 2,000 years ago and were barely literate, and there are these Hebrew people on the other side of the world, completely different culture, it's completely irrelevant to us today. And then you feel like you want to jump in and you're ready with 3 or 4 or 10 things you can say immediately. But to make a claim like that, that person has made a truth claim. They must be able to defend it. Or they will say, the Bible, this is very popular on the internet, the Bible has been changed so many times. We have no idea what the original texts say. That's a good one to use this technique on, because that's absolute utter nonsense. And there's absolutely no proof for that. In fact, there's a ton of proof to the contrary. But instead of just jumping into, but did you know that in the British Museum, there is a fragment from the Gospel of John that dates to 125 AD. And that means that all the other Gospels had to have been written, don't go there yet. They made a claim. Oh, that's an interesting viewpoint. What evidence have you seen for that claim? They are making a claim. So let them prove it before you jump in and offer all your proofs. Because the chances are they have none. They watched the TikTok video and said that. So, okay. And then you can also use a question just to make a point. If you rephrase what they said in a certain way, you can suddenly see. I'm trying, I think it was JP Morland or one of those apologetics guys was talking to a student in his room one day, and the guy was talking about relativism and saying, everybody should just decide what is right and wrong for them. And he took their stereo and he walked out. It's like, okay, bye. That was when people still had stereos. And he could have asked him, so you mean it's okay if I just take your stereo? Because for me, that's not a problem. Is it a problem? If it's a problem for you, that's your problem. Not my problem. I decided for myself. I think I'm deserving of this radio, and I'm going to take it with me. So if it phrased, he could have asked him. So it would be okay with you if I went around killing toddlers, for fun. So you're asking a question, rephrasing what they said. So everybody can just do what they feel is right. What if I thought it was right to go around killing toddlers? That question makes a point. You don't have to say a lot after that. Okay. So the first question in the Colombo omnibus, there's just 2 questions that we're talking about tonight, is what do you mean by that? So for instance, if this hostess now said something like, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you are sincere, you can ask her, what do you mean by that? So, and then maybe she'll respond to, what rugby team you support, or something completely, irrelevant or unimportant. And then you'll just laugh and say, absolutely. But if she then goes on to say, look, all religions are basically the same. So as long as you sincerely put your faith in whatever religion it is that you're following, that's great. Okay. So, and then we can go from there. What would any of you respond if somebody said that? Like, all religions are basically the same. How would you respond to that? Does anybody want to venture an answer.
I would say to her, why do you believe that?
Yes.
Why do you? Because she's put forward a proposition,
Yes.
but it's not really what's causing that proposition in her life. Do you
Yes.
know what I mean?
Yes.
That's what you've got to get to behind
Yes.
what they say.
You are exactly right, because that's the second question, is how did you come to that conclusion? Exactly. So because, and it's important to ask this in a non-threatening way, because that can sound very like, how did you come to that conclusion? Don't say it like that. Just say, that's interesting. I wonder, how did you come to believe that? Or what evidence led you to believe this? Because often there's none. There's no evidence. It's just something that at some point they decided, somebody said this on the internet or something, and they thought, oh, I kind of like that. I'm going to say that from now on. Literally. And so Greg Koukl calls it a house with no walls. He says it's like a roof that's standing on the ground. It's a conclusion, but it has nothing to support it. It has no support. So let's say we take the pluralism thing again, when she said, well, all the religions are basically the same. They all say the same. I just watched a video of this yesterday from a lady. She calls herself a witch. Very eccentric old lady with a weird hat and what makes a TikTok video. And she says, like, all the religions are the same. They all believe in love and peace. And I don't know what the other thing was that she said, something ridiculous, but they are all basically the same. It's just these little details, and people have got hung up on all these little, and the prophets over the ages came, and they knew this, they discovered this, but then people went and they twisted their words and they added all kinds of things to that, and it's a bunch of nonsense, all this religion, all this love and peace and whatever else. I think is so what she demonstrates is an absolute ignorance of the major religions of the world, because they do agree on some things, but they very seriously disagree on some very basic, important things. That, I mean, so the Muslims believe Jesus didn't die. The Jews believe Jesus came and he died. The Christians believe Jesus came and he died and he rose again. They can't all be right. They can all be wrong, but they can't all be right. So somebody's wrong and somebody's right. And that's a very serious thing. Jesus was the most influential person in history. And these three religions have a serious disagreement about who was Jesus. He was either the savior of the world, or a prophet of little consequence, or somebody completely off his rocker who was telling lies and trying to twist the Jewish faith. They can't all be right. So obviously she has no clue what any of these religions actually say. So how, if you can ask her, shift the burden of proof, like you said, oh, that's an interesting, when you talk about which religion specifically are you referring to? And what do you know about these religions? Like, what do you think Christians believe? What do you think Muslims believe? And it might be a very long conversation. But if she starts talking and you can say, well, that's very interesting, but that's not what the majority of scholars say about this issue, for instance. So then you can take it from there. So that was our example of that. So here's another one. And this is also popular on the internet and with, TikTok and many, when people make an objection to the existence of God, this is often one that says, how can you still believe in a God of love when you look at all the evil in the world? And with this one, it's quite important to try and determine, where does this come from? Why does this person ask this question? If you know them very well, you don't have to try and explore that first. But if it's somebody you don't know very well, because a lot of times this question comes from an emotional place. It comes from a place of hurt. And if you can ask, I use this, you can say, when you say evil, what do you mean by evil? But you can also ask, you can ask them back. So I take it from your question that you no longer, but do you still believe in God? And then they'll say probably, no, because And then you can ask, well, how did you come to that point? And maybe they'll tell you, well, my mother was murdered on a farm somewhere and people tortured her and she was a believer and this awful thing happened, and how can there be a God of love who allows this to happen? And then you're not going to start with the thesis of the free will defense of evil and the existence of God and a whole philosophical debate. That would be unloving. So that would mean a whole different approach to somebody who is, for instance, saying this in a debate, in a cold, reasoned, logical debate. The person on the stage saying, look, logically, there cannot be a God of love in a world of evil. Then the right question is, okay, when you say evil, what do you mean by evil? What is evil? How do we know that something is evil? Based on what? Popular consensus? Exactly. So if popular consensus in Germany in the 1930s was that Jews are not worthy of being alive, and that the Third Reich is meant to expand into the Lebensraum and we must just wipe out everybody. That was the popular consensus. And in China, with Mao Zedong and those, Chairman Mao, they murdered millions. They still don't know how many people they murdered. They still don't know. Millions and millions and millions of people, scientists, anybody who showed any dissent. The populace agreed with this thing, that there is no God, you're not allowed to say it, you must just follow Chairman Mao, the popular consensus. So is that what determines? Obviously not. There cannot be an objective standard of right and wrong if there's not an objective lawgiver, and that can only be God. So that would be on a logical level, but be careful of this question because, like I said, most of the time it comes from a place of emotion. Yes?
What would you answer that person, the one that asks it from
emotion? I think questions would be the main thing to use, to keep asking them, to say, so what happened? It sounds like you've experienced some pain. And to let them talk and to sympathize and to say, that is awful. That is awful. That is so. And if they ask you again, so what do you think? Like, how can people do stuff like that? To say, like, that is exactly why Jesus had to come. Because the world is so messed up that people can descend to such a level of evil that they can do something like that to a person. Clearly, we cannot save ourselves. That is why Jesus had to come. And thank God, from a biblical worldview, that this life is not all there is. That even if somebody endured the worst kind of suffering during the last minutes or hours of their life, they went into glory if they put their trust in Christ. And that even if they died in an awful way, we can rejoice because we know that they are in heaven now, and that short period of suffering, like Jesus' suffering on the cross, ensured, not ensured, but they now have an eternity of joy. But you would have to, if they ask.
I know that they did not believe.
The person. Well, the thing is, the person that died.
Family,
Look,
non-religious.
Okay, so yeah.
I don't want to put now on them.
Yeah.
If they believed in God,
yeah. Okay, so that would be, I'm sorry, I referred to my own example, like if you had a mother who was a believer, and why didn't Jesus help her in that moment? So then obviously I wouldn't use that assurance that we know that that person is, but we still do not know, because we don't know in the last moments of a person's life, even if it's the last few seconds, if Jesus met them. Like the guy on the cross. If Jesus met them, we don't know that. But then the comfort would be in to be able to condemn what the people did to that person. If it was somebody who killed them, for instance. The only worldview from which you can say that is objectively evil is a biblical worldview. An atheist worldview doesn't account for that, because then it's just wrong because it's, at the moment people think that's a bad thing to do. That's a little weak. Yeah. And you don't know where that guy came from, who did that. Maybe he was mistreated as a child, and now you can't say that, it's okay, that he did. It's not okay. Why is it not okay? Because because the Bible tells us it's not okay. And that we're all accountable, and that the world is so messed up. Look, the Bible gives a wonderful explanation for why there's so much evil in the world. Because of the fall. everything broke, everything shattered. Now the place is full of broken glass and sharp edges. That's a wonderful explanation for what, but it doesn't end there. Thankfully, there's hope, and thankfully, there's going to be redemption and restoration. That the Bible gives us that as well. So to come back to the big story, yes.
Funny enough, this is weird. A couple of nights ago, I was sort of in the throes of going to sleep, and I have this. I have conversations with various people as I'm going to sleep. I was talking to somebody that I didn't know, and they said, how slightly different. They asked me, how can you believe in God when there's so much pain? And and in the past, in the Bible, he ripped nations up and this and that. And how can you love this God that's ruthless and this God that is, that is wrathful? And my answer to him was a hymn. My answer was, the strange thing about human beings, they don't ascribe glory to God when things are going well.
Yes.
They only ascribe pain to God
yes.
when things are going bad to them. And I said, if my wife only interacted with me when she was angry with me, when she said, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right, we wouldn't be married together. I said, so that's not acceptable to human beings, but you want it to be acceptable to God.
Yes.
And I said, the patent, and I call some things are called absolute facts, where you can't, you can't, I'm alive at the moment, you're alive. That's an absolute fact.
Yes.
I mean, no one can.
Yes.
The absolute fact is the world's turned its back on God. And God has warned and said, listen, if that happens, bad things are going to happen. And guess what? Bad things are going to happen, and you're ascribing it to God.
Yeah.
And that was the conversation I had.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I had this conversation. I've never been an apologetics person.
Well, maybe you should become one. I think you've got a lot of potential. You're doing really good so far.
That's in my mind. That's how I play.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
I like that. And I think, coming back to the big story of the Bible, and I said this last week also, you can't engage people about their worldview or address issues in a secular worldview if you don't have a biblical worldview yourself, and you can't have a biblical worldview, you don't read the Bible. You have to get back to the Bible. My best friend from university, we got into apologetics together a while ago, and we started our book club together. And she's now an apologetics junkie. And she has, since so much in her life has changed, because she's come from a very charismatic and a very superficial kind of church background. And a lot of strange things happened. And when she started becoming reasonable about her faith and reasoning about things, all of a sudden she realized a lot of what she believed in the past was nonsense. And now she has, for the first time, read through the whole Bible. And her husband, who she always thought was the kind of Christian that just doesn't read his Bible and doesn't pray, has actually since been saved, because he actually started reading the Bible, and now he's totally addicted to the Bible. He's read through the whole thing with one of his sons, and he told his mom, like, Mom, Dad wants to start again when we're finished. And they're so excited about the Bible. And she said to me the other day, someone said to her, you know what? I think we should just enjoy God. We should just enjoy him. I feel that God told me I shouldn't read the Bible. I must just enjoy him. And then she was able to use tactics, because we worked through tactics last year, and she was like, oh, what do you mean by enjoying God? And then started a whole conversation, and then managed to show this lady that is totally unbiblical. To say that God would tell you to leave his word, not to read his word, not engage with his word, is a completely unbiblical, and you're going to go so far off the rails. But she first started with a question, like, what do you mean by that? So those are some questions we can ask when it comes to the question of evil or pain and suffering. But what is the measure of good and evil? Again, like I said, if there's no objective lawgiver there is no objective moral law. If you can get someone to agree with one objective, to say, Peter Kreeft always uses the example to say that torturing innocent babies for fun is wrong. If somebody in an auditorium dared to differ with that statement, you would have them committed, because you can't really, so then if you can get one objective moral law, there must be an objective moral lawgiver. That's the moral argument for the existence of God, by the way. It's a difficult one to use, but some people, Andre loves it. Okay, so how do we know what is right and wrong? It's the same thing. What specifically made you wonder about that? So that's a nice question also to use about many things. If somebody says, like, how can you still believe this or that? Ask them, what made you wonder about that? To get an idea of where are they coming from pain? Are they coming from a TikTok video? Are they coming from a family member? Because often issues with gender and things like that is also because somebody has somebody in their family that's struggling with this, and they love that person, and they just don't want to, they feel like if they hold on to the biblical truth, they have to reject this person, and they don't want to do that. So ask what made you wonder about this? And then I said this last week, why is it better to greet your neighbor than to eat your neighbor? It's the concept of that there is something like objective right and wrong. And if an atheist or somebody with a naturalistic worldview that says there is no God would claim that something is wrong, it doesn't mean that they can't be a good person. They can be a wonderful person. They just have no logical basis for deciding what is right and wrong. And people will often these days, they will make, in sexuality, consent has become the only ethic. If you any secular books about sexuality and what is acceptable, consent is now the only issue. Why? Why is it important to give consent? Why is it better to greet your neighbor than to eat your neighbor? Why is consent important? And then hurting, if hurt becomes the only argument, why is hurting bad? And what is hurt? When am I really hurting someone or harming them? Because they want to shout, the liberals want to shout harm when we use a certain word. That's harmful. And what is harm? So if somebody went and abused a person who is in a coma, or a baby who is not yet aware of what is going on, and not physically cause pain, is that wrong? I think almost everybody would agree, even somebody who is not a Christian. That is still wrong, but he didn't physically hurt the person. Now is that it's wrong? You just know it's wrong. There was this case in Germany that the husband whose wife was in a coma for many years, and he had people coming in and use his wife while she was in a coma, and she discovered this many years later, and there was video material of it, and maybe they didn't physically hurt her. That is harmful, but is harmful in a different way. And how do you know it's wrong? Because we have what the Bible says, we have an internal moral compass. We do know, we have a conscience. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I want you to remember that the truth of the biblical worldview can stand up to scrutiny. What I mean by that is, you don't have to be afraid to engage with people of other worldviews. You don't have to be afraid to teach your children that there are other worldviews, that there are other beliefs, because the biblical worldview is based on truth. It's true. I'm a Christian for many reasons, but one of them at least is that it is true. If they discovered Jesus' body and there was unequivocal proof that it was the body of Jesus and he never rose from the dead, then we shouldn't be Christians, because then it's not true. But there is masses of historical evidence to indicate that he did actually physically rise from the dead. And that's not the only reason why we are Christians. It probably started as a loving relationship with Jesus, and I only later discovered all the evidence. But you don't have to be scared. The biblical worldview can stand up to scrutiny. If you hear questions where you think, oh my goodness, I don't know how to answer that. That, like, maybe these biblical passages sound conflicting, or whatever objection you've heard, I promise you there's an answer out there. And it can stand up to scrutiny. And then just another reminder to leave a pebble in their shoe, not drop a rock on their head, the goal. And then, and I just, if I think back over my life of misconceptions that I had, or maybe sinful ideas that I had, that changed over time, it didn't usually change in an instant. And the people who influenced that change probably never knew that they had actually made that change happen inside me, because it wasn't immediately, oh, you're right, my parents were wrong all these years, and now, oh my goodness, I didn't respond like that. I was like, oh, okay, maybe, or maybe I just didn't say anything and I thought, ooh, that's silly. And then I went and thought about it afterwards and then realized maybe this person has a point. And then I met someone else and they said something else. And that changed a little bit. And that changed. And now I'm light years away from where I started. But it was a pebble in my shoe. Okay, and to be loving and respectful. And don't be afraid to engage even if you don't have all the answers. You don't now all have to go and do a master's degree in apologetics from Biola University to be able to engage people with other worldviews. You can always tell someone, that is a very interesting question. You know, I've never heard that one before, or I've never thought about that, but I'm sure there is an answer to it. Would you mind if I got back to you on that? I'm pretty sure they wouldn't mind. If you are wanting to give them a thoughtful answer instead of just responding in something that they would call, a bigoted, biased or unthoughtful way, tell people, I'm going to go read up on it. And if you don't have the book, we probably have it in our library. Okay, and then but equip yourself with answers. There are some basic things that I think we as Christians should know. We should know some of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because it's the central miracle of our faith. And there's wonderful historical evidence for that. We should know that the Bible is not the telephoontjie game where they play with the one person whispers and then the other person and translate it again. That's nonsense. Utter nonsense. We should know that. Maybe you can just learn a couple of numbers and facts about some of the early documents. And you should maybe know a few of the arguments for the existence of God. And some of them are really pretty simple. You don't have to be an utter genius. You can teach them to kids. The Kalam cosmological argument is very simple. So equip yourself. And if you want to know how to do that, maybe we can talk. Okay, and then just some suggested resources for the stuff that I talked about tonight. Faithfully Different is the book that I referred to a lot last week. I haven't finished the whole book, but I've listened to most of it. And what's really nice is she has a whole section on doubt. And what does doubt mean and what it doesn't mean. And she talks about evidence for the existence of God, and she talks about common objections that atheists will make that are just a misconception of what the biblical worldview is. Tactics, if anybody wants to look at the book, I have it here. Then on YouTube, Sean McDowell, like I said, he's a wonderful example of how to engage in a loving and respectful, and he never compromises. He is solidly biblical, but he's so loving. And then Red Pen Logic with Mr. B is one of my my absolute favorite person to watch on Facebook. He comments, if you see TikTok videos or just social media posts that's like this utter nonsense, that if it's trending and a lot of people have watched it, there's a good chance he has commented on that video. And then he will say, okay, this person says this. What does the Bible say? How could you as a Christian respond to that? And he's very loving. I watched a video this week of a debate where he comments on a debate between a lady and Michael O'Connell, I think. They were talking about abortion, and she says something, and this guy responds in a certain way, and she completely misses his point. And then he says something again, and then she misses it even. She's like, clearly, she's not very clever, and that is putting it very kindly. She's like completely not supposed to be in a debate. And Mr. B does not say it. I'm like, that is the utter proof of his kindness, the fact that he didn't comment on her IQ in that video. He just said that she completely misses the point. So he's a great guy to listen to, and he's very good with spotting fallacies that people use. And then on Spotify, Stand to Reason is the organization that Greg Koukl started. So Mr. B from Red Pen Logic works for Stand to Reason as well. And their podcast is STR Ask. So people will have questions, send them questions, and then they will answer it in a podcast. So I listened this week to one where they say, like somebody, an LGB person told me that they are happy with who they are. How do I respond to that? And then they had a wonderful exchange between him and Amy about how do you respond to that. Okay, so that is my whole song for tonight, and it went on a little bit longer than I planned.